Hello everyone, today I'll make the first video of a series dedicated to Easter. And specifically, today it's the day of the Avignon Papacy for our historical regional series. We never really discussed this even in a broader thematic sense, which may seem odd because we actually have over 200 videos about the history of Christianity. The channel focuses on the Middle Ages, but I was sort of skirting around it because it's a very important topic, very dense one. Naturally, I referenced to the Avignon Papacy in many videos. I made one about John the 22nd's crusade against the Visconti. I talked about sort of the general Guelph, Papal, Neapolitan, French alliance at this point. We will have a way today to see that there wasn't such a thing like a Babylonian captivity as in some especially Italian contexts, it was described, because the Avignon Papacy was always independent from anyone. The fact that the French were allied, and naturally most popes at this point in history were French, naturally it sort of blends in with the rest of the international scenery. And as you know, the papal career will end up returning to Rome, that obviously had never lost the centrality, the sacredness, the ecumenic meaning in the history of mankind. So this is incredibly important because the Avignon Papacy also occurs extending from March the 9th, 1309 to January the 13th, 1377 to be precise, across the great crisis of medieval civilization. You know that on Schwerpunkt this topic comes up way more frequently than probably any other place that I'm aware of. I must say that, when I was at university, I wasn't particularly bombarded with the crisis of the later Middle Ages, but the more I studied medieval history, the more I realized how sort of underrated in many ways this is, at least in as much as, especially in this series about the historical regions of Europe, you can see properly a pattern of gradual shrinking, crisis, and transformation due to the plague, but also the plague as a consequence of a broader crisis, the broader crisis of the great medieval civilization, of universal powers. And so studying the Avignon Papacy at this point is studying actually a pretty crucial aspect in the history of the church, in the history of Europe and the world, that gets a bit too much sort of sucked into the debate of this general malaise, these petty issues that sometimes like historians present regarding this moment, like the free companies, the plague, etc., without sort of reasoning a bit more comprehensively about the meaning of the shrinking of the papacy of the empire at this point in history. About that, you have lots of videos that I made, not just in the playlist dedicated to the, in fact, late medieval crisis. Recently, I submitted an article that eventually was approved in an A-class journal. And you will probably be reading that. And was one of the peer reviewers that are supposed to be, in this sense, fairly qualified, that said, yeah, okay, the article goes well, but what does what is the crisis of the late Middle Ages? I've never heard of this. And this was so funny. And then you wonder why sometimes I take the tangents and the sort of general criticism on Schwerpunkt, because you have the opportunity to say things a bit less filtered than what happens also in the higher spheres, so to say. And I descend, quite ghostly to you to announce the good news. But jokes aside, and sort of delirium of omnipotence aside in particular, let's talk about the Avignon Papacy, right? That constitutes, among other things, one of the longest, most structurally transformative, most debated interruptions, at least of the Roman See, in the history of the medieval church. And for this, we will have to make lots of videos properly about the city of medieval Rome, which is incredibly underrated for a number of reasons. Also, not just papal history, that admittedly people don't study at all, apparently. Especially in pop culture, does not have any relevant coverage. And that, however, also entails an enormous lay power in the city, as it could leverage the same in this broader, universal international struggle and issues. Think about the previous years. We will partly address this with Boniface VIII struggling, even with the nominal ally in the international scene, Philip IV of France, and more. Now, during these 67 years of Avignonese papacy, 7 pontiffs, Clement V, elected June the 5th, 1305, and reigning until April the 20th, 1314. John the 22nd, elected on August the 7th, 1316, and reigning until December the 4th, 1334. Benedict the 12th, elected on December the 20th, 1334, and reigning until April the 25th, 1342. Clement VI, elected on May the 7th, 1342, and reigning until December the 6th, 1352. Innocent VI, elected on December the 18th, 1352, and reigning until September the 12th, 1362. Urban V, elected on October the 28th, 1362, and reigning until December the 19th, 1370. And Gregory XI, elected on December the 30th, 1370, and reigning until March the 27th, 1378, directed the Universal Latin Church from a residence on the left bank of the Rhone in Avignon. Right? We will learn why this center was so important. By the way, Avignon is a lovely place. The Papal Palace is naturally the major attraction, but there is also a deep, I really advise to visit the place, like a broader tour of southern France in general. But it had a deeper symbolical meaning, political, strategical, international, even logistical sense, because effectively from this side of the Rhone, you had the Holy Roman Empire. From the other side, you had the Kingdom of France, right? And especially if you look at the so-called geopolitics, geopolitics does not exist, of especially mid-14th century Europe, you realize that Avignon had a very central location. Like, it was located at the center of some of the greatest powers out there, right? In all of this, as we will learn, naturally, the Papal States remained as the main bulk of papal power. There were some important attempts at reform, also to pave the way for the return of the popes. We'll talk about Egidio Albornoz, as a matter of fact, the Spanish cardinal that we've seen actually in action in the video about the Rio Salado, for telling you, against the Moors, for telling you also what kind of calibers we're discussing at this point in history. All 7 of the aforementioned popes were natives of territories that today form part of France, yet their regional origins frequently aligned more closely, and this is a very important distinction, with the Occitan-speaking South. Right? They were historically 2 different nations. Right? What we call the French is essentially an expansion of roughly today's northern France, with Brittany excluded and other parts, especially in the east. But we're here talking Gascony for Clement V, born in Villandrat near Bazas. Quercy for John the 22nd, was born in Cahors. The county of Foix for Benedict XII, born in Saint-Vertin. Limousin for Clement VI, born in Rosiers-de-Gletton. And Gregory XI, also born in Rosiers-de-Gletton. The Limousin Highlands for Innocent VI, born near Mons in the Diocese of Limoges, and the Gévaudan that we have also seen for the Beast in the 18th century for Urban V, born in Rizac near Mende. Then with the northern French domains that supplied the principal advisors, administrators, and military resources of the Capetian and early Valois kings. Admittedly, we're looking at here at a very different Occitania from the times of, say, the Cathars. Like, this place had been taken over by the French, so actually most of these people were, in any case, French in a broader cultural, even linguistical sense. But it is true in a broader regional sense, especially during the 14th century, when the 100 Years' War was raging, and the English and the Gascons themselves at some point successfully cut off also to the detriment of the South, northern France from the rest of its possessions. The historical sort of regional divides, even among French, langue d'oil speaking elite and establishments in the South, sort of change a little bit in general political orientation. This does not mean that Avignon Papacy was essentially against the Capetians per se, but again, the notion that this was essentially a papacy kidnapped by the French is not really a historically accurate, not even remotely, by the way, idea. This also for expressing, as we'll see now, how actually autonomous the papacy was, right? And there isn't, by the way, just the sort of crisis period. The first decades are one of the single most traumatically overwhelming display of military power in the entire Middle Ages, namely, the armies of Pope John the 22nd. The papacy could spend 1,200,000 florins just in a single season at this point in the crusade against the Visconti, as a matter of fact. We've seen it in the video about, not just about the same, about this crusade that I made a video on, but in the one about the richest powers in Europe, like the papacy actually figured like this. And we're talking about astronomical ciphers and enormous armies that for some reason nobody discusses because they simply didn't make it in the Anglo-American medieval history disclosure in books, so to say. But the history of medieval Europe is staggeringly much more expansive and substantially at a point actually more important than the one that is normally popularized, and in some topics people have literally no clue about what we are discussing. In any case, again, this was the Avignon Papacy was the product of a French, essentially Guelph, Papal, Neapolitan force, axis, I don't know if you want to call it, right? Yet, still, the southern cultural and linguistic horizon shaped the outlook of the Curia in ways that northern French observers and later critics writing in the Langue d'Oil often found difficult to reconcile with the universal claims also of the Roman pontificate, right? At least because also the same debate revolving around universalism was actually arising at that point with incredibly violent and prepotent terms. And you know that the later end of the Avignon Papacy is also entwined with the issue of the so-called Age of Councils that lasts for more than 1 century, and that in any case also paves the way to different heretical spread once again against the same papacy, however, so not from their side. In the wake of the great crisis of medieval civilization, the same reformation actually stemming from that. I made an entire video about this. In any case, all the useful links are in the top fixed comment down below as usual. The preponderance of Gascon, Languedocian, and Provençal personnel in the household and chancery contributed to a distinct tone of administration that, again, contemporaries from beyond the Loire sometimes perceived as provincial or even alien to the traditional Roman gravitas, right? And this is also interesting because, indeed, the papacy had been a much more prestigious enterprise before, right? It's not at this point it was sort of lessened, if not by the crisis. It should all be also pointed out that, in fact, the sort of Occitanians in general had been very involved in the same cause of the broader Axis, especially in Italy, where the greater battles were being fought between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines for all of Europe to depend on, essentially. And you find, in fact, lots of those commanders. Some of you have asked me, like, why don't you talk about Ramon de Cardona, for example? And again, there are Bertrand de Pouget, those are big names. If you don't know who they are, like, please check that out. Now, the relocation originated in the protracted and ultimately violent crisis that pitted, as we said before, Boniface VIII, who reigned between 1294 and 1303. That, contrarily to all those videos, which was the most evil pope in the Middle Ages, was one of the greatest popes in the history of the church. An incredibly capable, smart, effective, powerful ruler, against Philip IV of France, other sort of giant, of course, in the landscape of the peak of medieval civilization, who reigned between 1285 and 1314. The bull Unam Sanctam, promulgated on November the 18th, 1302, asserted in exceptionally uncompromising language the necessity of submission to the Roman pontiff for salvation, and placed temporal rulers under the spiritual jurisdiction of the church, declaring it a matter of faith that every human creature be subject to the Roman pontiff. This theologically does not make any wrong, right? It's obvious, it's inherent, the papal monarchy, the imperial Catholic traditional point of it all. Caesaropapism is the theme of some videos that I made, in fact, especially on this, also on Gallicanism for that matter, and the contrast that in general existed throughout all the Renovatio Imperii between the imperial and papal prerogatives, as they had never been fully outlined in a way recognized by both. And that was not even that big of a problem, in the sense that Western civilization literally boomed thanks to the spin-off brought by this conflict that, in any case, was also one of alliance, of cooperation, mutual recognition. In fact, at this point where essentially the German Empire was basically shrinking and literally sort of withdrawing north of the Alps, the actual imperial power in Europe was by far France, right? And so when you look at the struggle between Philip IV and Boniface VIII, it's not that different from the one of, Frederick II and the papacy in 50 years before, all right, in terms of who were the actual heads of Christendom and why. Naturally, the theological background to this should be discussed in other videos. Today we make mostly history of the Avignonese papacy per se. Obviously, we will address some of these issues, as obviously, like talking about the Unam Sanctam requires. However, everything will be clear in many other videos that we still haven't also inexplicably made. In fact, you know how it ended. Right? Philip responded to the Unam Sanctam by convoking assemblies of the French clergy, nobility, and the Third Estate that accused Boniface of heresy, simony, illicit relations, and illegitimate possessions of the papal office, because they were pushing themselves as French, essentially a Ghibelline perspective as far as at least who had to be properly in charge of this wealth access was concerned. Obviously, the lay authority that was understood as sacred, as imperial, right? The king's jurists, in particular, drafted libels that circulated widely and framed the Pope as a usurper who had subverted both divine and natural law. We constantly underestimate the power of medieval propaganda that was incredibly successful, and it's actually a good thing for it to be in a civilizational sense, to the point that contemporary people still believe in the French and Colonnese propaganda against Boniface VIII, which is the same kind of absolutely anti-historical regurgitation you see in the videos, like with, the thumbnail with the Pope with the horn, the devil's horn, etc. It's always about Boniface VIII, or right about it's either the synod of the corpse, or or Boniface VIII was a pedophile, whatever. If you believe that, like, you don't have any clear understanding about medieval politics, not even just the overwhelmingly large historiography existing on the French, the Colonnese, for that matter also the papal propaganda itself. It's just you wanting to believe it, sort of to keep echoing certain 19th century, very often Protestant, fiercely anti-papistic scholars that left the sort of notion, and then people parrot it because they don't have a satisfactory education. But we're unfortunately habituated to that by 2026. Guillaume de Nogaret, the king's most trusted counselor and keeper of the seal, organized the armed incursion into Anagni, see of, at that point, of the papal curia. I made some videos explaining why the Pope resided very often, more than in Rome, in some various towns surrounding that in Lazio. We talk about Sutri, the meetings with Henry V back in the day. Like, there are some key towns that, by the way, the popes were trying to sort of link up in a coalition against the same Rome that naturally was by far the biggest city and that had ambitions of conquest, like the other Italian communes, over these surrounding towns. We are on September the 7th, 1303. Boniface, then aged approximately 68, was seized in his family palace, physically mistreated, including, according to some contemporary accounts, famously by a blow to the face from Nogaret or Sciarra Colonna. Sciarra Colonna was essentially the top Roman Ghibelline in the picture, one of the greatest commanders of his era, together with Castruccio, Cangrande, etc. We'll surely make a video about him. Definitely a gauntlet in the face, especially a 68-year-old of the time. Like, it's not very helpful, but it seems like it's just like a metaphor, right, to stress how brutal this thing really was, as we'll see now. In fact, Boniface was held captive for 3 days before local inhabitants liberated him. And by the way, the French and their colonnades supporters sacked the papal treasury that was present in Anagni, and that also helped, so to say. As you know, Philip IV did not have many scruples in front of the Templars, in front of the Jews, in front of the same Lombards. It's all people that at some point or another had also supported the kingdom, but they needed money fast, because also this great medieval civilization was gradually stalling, right, in order to maintain that leviathan that France had become in the previous century. Like this resources had to be so from any possible place with every possible means. Deeply shaken, the Pope died on October the 11th of the same year, reportedly from the combined effects of the trauma and pre-existing illness, however, possibly renal calculi exacerbated by the ordeal. Benedict the 11th was elected in, I will skip the dates because we recounted them before, right? So was elected later in the month in Perugia. Umbra also made a video about medieval Perugia if you're interested. He sought at that point, Perugia, by the way, was a fiercely black Guelph commune. It means that they were incredibly loyal to the Pope in the Apennine heartland and very center of the Papal States. And at that point, the Pope, well protected by the Perugian walls, sought to de-escalate this conflict with France. It obviously, and just for telling you how powerful this axis really was, that if you really want to look at the greatest medieval civilization, it's this one: France, Guelphs, Pope, Neapolitans. All right, these guys dominate from the Channel to the Aegean. They're the greatest medieval power, right, in Europe, and in a broader sense, comparable with all the other great powers out there in history. Also for the sheer, the entire level of sort of statal, bureaucratic, theological, administrative, legal, artistic, banking, like everything, basically, like medieval civilizations lays in here. The overwhelming majority of Europeans demographically living in these places, it's enormous. All right, and so they could afford, while they were actively fighting against the emperor, against the Ghibelline bloc, to fight, like in this case, against one another. This was very much ad personam. There wasn't ever like a war between, say, I don't know, the French or the papacy in terms of armies fighting against one another. This was an incursion. Again, here we should digress in the detail. At some point, we will make also a video about that. Also, from a military point of view, it's very interesting. How did they attack the Pope in Anagni, in the palace, from the city? It's incredibly interesting. But they could quarrel with one another without breaking the alliance whatsoever. At this point, in front of the world, papacy and the King of France were inoxidable allies, were as institutions. This is very important also from a theological point of view. It's the guys in office that are failing. The office is perfect and aligned very deeply, as we've seen also in the videos about King Robert, by the way, probably in the education of these French rulers. In that particular case, I would say French rulers that sought, essentially, just like the papacy, an imperial power. Essentially, both were claiming that they were the only absolute, at least the top absolute universal authority to whom everybody else had to obey. Right? We've seen this countless times in the investiture controversy. So it's the same exact thing. So what does Benedict XI do to stop this? He lifts, at this point, most sentences imposed on Philip and his agents, although he maintained excommunication against Nogaret and the Colonna cardinals who had aided the attack, as we were saying. Benedict died suddenly the following summer After thus only 8 months in office, some chroniclers suspected poison, though no conclusive evidence supports the charge, leaving the conclave that convened in Perugia deeply divided between a pro-French faction willing to accommodate Philip's demands and a pro-still Bonifacian faction still loyal to the memory of the aggressive theocratic program of the late Gaetani Pope. After 11 months of deadlock, the cardinals elected Bertrand de Gaulle. This had been the Bishop of Bordeaux since 1299. We are again in June of 1305, so it's a long conclave. Bertrand had maintained cordial relations with Philip IV, as we were saying before. So it's not like the Occitanians were enemies of the King of France in this elite, hyper-feudal sense. And Vaux's Gasconcy placed him under, by the way, English suzerainty, yet within the French cultural and political orbit, accepted the tiara as Clement V. All right. He was crowned in Lyon on November 14, 1305. Consider that Lyon is not yet French. All right. This is technically still the Kingdom of Arles. Eventually, the French will take that, but we also made videos on that part of southeastern Gaul. He was crowned in the Basilica of Saint-Just with the same Philip IV present among the assembled nobility in a crowd so large that part of the temporary wooden stands collapsed, killing several spectators, including John II, Duke of Brittany, who succumbed to injuries 4 days later. If you're interested, by the way, in the Gascon affairs, you can check out my video about Edward II's rule of England, rule of Aquitaine, that was pretty disastrous in the end. And so this was not actually a moment in which the English were particularly threatening to the hyperpower of the French king. Clement never crossed the Alps to enter Italy as Pope. Interestingly enough, he resided in, and so this election was brokered in a sense under the same oversight of Philip IV. So obviously, it tended to make a bit in a Gallican fashion this election a bit from his own side. Clement resided initially in Bordeaux, his native region, then moved to Poitiers, and finally settled the Curia in Avignon on March the 9th, 1309. And this is the actual beginning of the Avignonese papacy, if anything, from a location standpoint. The choice was strategic, as we were hinting at, on several levels. Avignon lay within the county of Provence, held by the Angevin kings of Naples, who acknowledged papal overlordship as vassals of the Holy See. Right? This entanglement is quite relevant because, as you know, I made some videos about Charles of Anjou, also about the times and meaning of the Battle of Tagliacozzo, had successfully acquired the county of Provence, which actually made him, in this sense, a Holy Roman Imperial vassal, right? But he had, from there, launched his crusade against Manfred of Sicily, taking over Naples. And Naples, in and of itself, the Kingdom of Sicily, was historically a vassal of the Holy See, right? The Normans had acknowledged this subordination to the papacy that had very particular privileges and in power to begin with in southern Italy, and will maintain that. And so this was a very good location where to establish the papal curia and some sort of more autonomous power, right? Because it was sort of in France, but not within the kingdom. It still was connected with the Angevins, and so the Capetians from the county of Provence, that was sort of also pretty close historically, as you know, to Tuscany in a cultural, literary sense. It was sort of easily accessible on the Rhone. It had literally the Holy Roman Empire and the French kingdom from both sides of the city, and so you had it was fairly close also to Germany, to Italy, for example, the Angevins had some Provençal Piedmontese power. All those Occitanian commanders we were talking before mostly operated there. And further down, Tuscany and Florence, that was the beating heart of the Guelph alliance and so on. So we're talking a very strong closeness to the key centers of power, right? The location, by the way, adjoined the Comtat Venaissin, that is the actual territory that will remain up to the French Revolution, actually in papal hands. It was acquired by the popes in 1274. Back then, it was an enclave. They had purchased it from Alphonse of Poitiers as part of the settlement following the Albigensian Crusade and the annexation of much of the Languedoc to the French crown. There were other enclaves of the papacy, such as Benevent, for example, in the same kingdom of Sicily, kingdom of Naples at this point, because, again, the Vespers, etc. But for showing how projecting papal power had historically been in its own way. Naturally, it was a symbolic power. The County of Venaissin is, we're talking about the Avignonese papacy is mostly all there is to say, as a general introduction, right? It's a simple county. The Avignonese position on the left bank of the Rhone facilitated communications with the northern half of Europe, while shielding the pontiff from the armed feuds that dominated Rome and much of central Italy as well. Right, that was engulfed, as we were saying before, in this devastating struggles. Rome, in particular, where the Colonna and the Orsini factions continued to wage private feuds with devastating consequences for the city's infrastructure and population. The largest urban battle of the Middle Ages was fought in Rome in 1312, when Henry VII of Luxembourg arrived to be crowned. So that gives you an idea. Literally a city split in half and completely barricaded, fortified, and full of towers. There's something that you don't see in modern Rome anymore, but was something utterly insane. Now, the move to Avignon was initially regarded as provisional. Right? There was no particular reason why there had to be even a full establishment there. The papal career had always been moving. So this was not new. It was new in as much as it was outside of Italy. And so this was initially intended to escape the aforementioned factual violence of the Roman noble houses. Also to allow Clement to negotiate with Philip IV without appearing to capitulate entirely. But the combination of Italian instability, persistent French pressure, the personal health concerns of Clement himself for that matter, and the growing administrative convenience of the site soon hardened into a semi-permanent arrangement that none of his successors fully reversed until 1377. It seemed really a very good idea. I don't know if you have, here I inserted it obviously prominently in the pictures, the idea of what the papal palace in Avignon looks like. It's a monstrous fortress. Right, good luck trying to besiege that, right? Even though they actually tried at some point. So it's also a safe. France is largely pacified, at least at this point. At the beginning, there is wait for the 100 Years' War, right? But there isn't anything particular going on with the situation. Like southern France has this local feuds and clashes, but there's small feudal things. They don't involve the papacy or other major powers intervening. Everything is obviously much less stable than we would think of today's world. However, it was a very good place to stay. Avignon, we've seen it recently, even in the videos about early Carolingian warfare. It had historically been a major Roman city in Provence that, again, was overly traumatically hyper-Romanized historically, so to maintain the name of Provincia, as a matter of fact. Now, Clement V's pontificate witnessed the formal suppression of the Order of the Temple, one of the most dramatic acts of coordinated royal and papal power in medieval Europe. I still haven't made a video about that either. That's actually pretty brutal, as you know, and dark and interesting and fascinating. Philip IV, as we were saying before, heavily indebted also to the same Templars, in fact, and determined to appropriate their wealth because they had sort of been losing steam with the loss of the Holy Land. They had been gentrifying and demilitarizing, orchestrated, because they had an enormous amount of property, to say the least. This mass arrests, especially in France, across the country on October the 13th, 1307, a day chosen for its symbolic weight as the eve of the Feast of Saint Denis, that we profusely discussed the meaning of. Clement, and so as monarchic power in particular, Clement initially resistant and expressing shock at the suddenness and brutality of the action in private correspondence, acquiesced under sustained pressure and transferred the examination of the order to the Council of Vienne, which he summoned in October 1311. This is quite instructive also for all the people who said, oh, the church was evil, they wanted to kill the temple. No, all right, that's not what happened. It's not the point. Like, largely, this was a matter of increasing sort of actually regionalistic affirmation. Here it's a matter of the Kingdom of France that, yes, has universal inspirations, but is starting to run out of steam itself to maintain this enormous and unparalleled system in Europe. We'll talk more about the fact that, of course, the monastic military orders were also a vestige of the same imperial power, properly meant the Holy Roman Imperial one, right? That was still the greater protector, had historically been, especially in the 13th century, the last hope of the orders in the Holy Land. Clement, so this council in Vienne, were attended by approximately 300 bishops and abbots, hesitating actually to condemn the Templars as a body on the basis of evidence presented, much of which had been obtained through torture and was regarded as unreliable by many prelates who questioned the validity of the confessions extracted under duress. So, definitely not the church that wanted the Templars out, regardless of, again, some fascist mysticism like, God, the Templars were trying actually to defenestrate the Great Mother. No, that's nothing to do, especially if you have idea what the Great Mother actually means in the European tradition once it's tamed and transfigured. But in any case, Philip, and it's not like there hadn't been frictions between the church and the monastic military orders. They definitely had different philosophies at a point, but what Philip was carrying out was unprecedented and highly disturbing. The king intervened personally, arriving in Vienne with a large retinue and threatening reprisals against the council if it did not comply with his wishes. On March the 22nd, 1312, Clement issued the bull Vox in Excelso, suppressing the order by apostolic authority rather than by judicial condemnation, citing the scandalous reputation it had acquired and the impossibility of its effective reform in the eyes of the faithful. Right. On May the 2nd, 1312, the Pope assigned its goods to the Hospitallers, by the way, so other order that remain intact, as you know, through the bull ad providem, although the French crown retained a substantial portion of the seized assets through various expedients, including the absorption of Templar preceptories into royal domains, the redirection of revenues to the crown's war chest, and the outright confiscation of movable property under pretext of royal rights of regalia, which were stressing, in fact, much of the prerogative of the regnum, not just over the sacerdotium, but truly in a broader universal sense, right? It's a sense of absolute earthly power. The episode marked a significant erosion of the papacy's independence in dealing with powerful secular rulers and set a precedent for future royal interventions in ecclesiastical affairs that would resonate through the remainder of the 14th century. As you know, some Templars eventually survived. Some countries were more hospitable to them. We've seen recently in the history of medieval Portugal how many ended up there. Some fled to other locations. In any case, this was mostly a French issue, and it was, again, a universal issue, right? France was the biggest country in Europe, so whatever happened there was sort of representative of what was largely going on there. We have seen recently, by the way, in the video I made on the Gonzaga, how Louis I, at the beginning of the 14th century, recounted, at least from his epitaph, the fact that apparently some Templars had taken refuge in Mantua, right? That the Gonzaga had helped them. In any case, John the 22nd, enormous pope. If you have no idea what he did, again, you're not in a good place in a strictly cultural, educational sense. Elected after a 2-year vacancy on, as we've seen, August the 7th, 1316, in the Dominican convent at Lyon, decisively consolidated the Avignon residence and transformed it into the effective capital of the Latin Church. Jacques Duez, born in Cahors around 1244-49, had served as Bishop of Avignon from 1310 to 1313. He, as you understand, possessed intimate knowledge of the city's infrastructure and its defensive possibilities. He was famous there, powerful, and so it made all sense for him. He enlarged the existing episcopal residence into a fortified palace that formed the nucleus of what you see, as we were describing, the later Palais des Papes, right? Which is also just in front of the bridge, sur le pont d'Avignon. That's all what it stems from, right? Because it's such a characteristic landscape. There are admin chambers, audience halls, defensive towers, and a treasury secure enough to house the rapidly accumulating papal revenues. We're talking, again, a staggeringly monstrous amount of wealth. Millions and millions of florins. All right? Most countries in Europe did not have alone the wealth that was stored in Avignon. John pursued an assertive policy towards the empire, insisting on the papal right to confirm imperial elections and to appoint vicars in Italy during vacancies of the imperial throne. And if you look at the years here, the 13th, we're talking the 10th of the 14th century, you know what is actually happening in Italy. Not just Henry VII's expedition has thrown the peninsula upside down, but even after his death, actually the greatest escalation has struck. Right, the Ghibellines are on a massive offensive. The Guelphs spend an enormous amount of money to combat them, and those who finance them, aside from themselves, because their bankers were also operating for the papacy for Naples, were in fact the papacy in Naples, and the Kingdom of France, not really much, right? But in a broader sense, obviously there was a connivance. In fact, at some point, what will become the later Philip VI of Valois also went over to Lombardy with an army, and he faced the Milanese, and he decided to come back to France and was apparently stunned by this Milanese army and said, oh my God, he never came to no French army ever came back. And so again, there were lots of Frenchmen, admitted also probably from the north, who were fighting, especially for the Guelph side, but then later also many Ghibellines started, already at this point actually, to hire them, Lorrainese, Burgundians, and so on. So John the 22nd is very important because he's also the Pope of Louis of Wittelsbach, as we will see now. If you're interested in Ludwig, you can check out my video biography on him. So this is a moment of a repeated imperial onslaught in the peninsula, and so also in a general ideological sense, this is the time of Marsilio of Padua, of William of Ockham. So all those that basically allowed, especially Louis of Wittelsbach, to pull out of Italy in a broader ideological sense and to claim that only Germany could confer the empire. This was actually a moment of withdrawal of both universal powers. It was a moment of defeat a bit for everyone, but it was also passing through this enormous military expenses, probably the single most intense in the entire medieval Europe, right? Actually, for sure. The papacy was highly financing all this, right? And since Henry VII had rebooted this practice of appointing imperial vicars in Italy, in particular in Milan, in Verona, that were the leaders, especially from the northern Ghibelline party. The objective of John the 22nd was to counter these guys, also the Tuscan Ghibellines for that matter, that were actually at the beginning the most insidious, and in controlling thus the finances, like sending out armies, propagating all the struggle, like excommunicating Ghibelline leaders, etc., and to actually claim universally that the same power, say the same right to the empire, pertained to the Pope. For example, Robert of Naples at some point was declared imperial vicar by whom? By the emperor? No, by the Pope, in northern Italy as well. This is very interesting because the Pope, just like Boniface VIII, we're still saying, like, basically, we are the ones who wield the empire. This is how straightforward and sort of incredibly shockingly the popes had gone. And this is actually also a very interesting phase from a strictly in terms of juridical theological reflection on the perspective of the two sides, because the idea that the popes should have been just about spiritual affairs and the emperors about the temporal one, as you understand, is metaphysical. So it's physically impossible, right? And metaphysically should be all in one, in God. So this was the ultimate and still coherent consequence, especially as the emperors themselves were a bit outside of the picture, at least in the most threatening way that had been at the time of the Hohenstaufen. And so what we see here is often not appreciated in terms of how intense, probably in terms of warfare it was, and how much of an iron arm of wrestling was occurring between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines, Europeanly meant at this point, Europeanly scaled, and how important the papacy was as a tip of the balance. We always tend to underestimate, we've seen it even in the videos about the Turkish wars, etc., how much the Pope was behind all of the current, obviously, sort of from his side here, is more exquisitely political, Guelph versus Ghibelline, but say the sheer amount of wealth that the papacy injected at all times to stabilize Christianity. At least here it's most controversial, if you want, that nobody actually discusses, because also they don't study the period in terms against the Ghibellines. But you also have to understand where they were coming from, and especially later in fighting against Islam, that nobody, and also in the previous times with the Crusades and even before the Crusades, that also nobody talks about. John the 22nd argued that the empire was vacant de jure after the double election of 1314, and that the Pope held the authority to administer imperial rights. This is an issue that happened in Germany, all right? And when Henry VII died, we've seen it with Ludwig and his cousin, Frederick the Fair of Austria, etc. So we'll get into, I want to make a video about the latter, because we never really discussed him. But this was an expedient to say, okay, well, if you don't even come up with a single emperor at this point, the Pope held authority to administer imperial rights in Italy in the interim. Go back to the 1075 Dictatus Papae, and you'll see how this was just the obvious, not even extreme of that concept, but the same application, right? So this was actually not anew, just politics had relatively mitigated it in the previous centuries. John's war with Louis IV of Bavaria escalated after Wittelsbach's victory over Frederick of Austria at Mühldorf. It was a major battle fought on September 28, 1322, where Louis won over his cousin and even captured later. So John, at this point, declared Louis' election invalid because he had backed Frederick and excommunicated him on October the 8th, 1323, after the emperor refused to acknowledge papal approbation as well. Louis retaliated thus by descending into Italy, largely supported by Italians, but differently from Henry VII, that had mostly, at least began the campaign with troops on his own. And this tells you also how, again, complicated Italy for the same popes really was, receiving the imperial crown in Rome from none less than Charles Colonna, the same guy that had de facto killed Boniface VIII. Where on January the 17th, 1328, this was very swift. Louis did not want to get bogged down into Italy. He was very clever in sort of kidnapping, getting the ransom, doing various things here and there. He doesn't stay in Rome long, and he comes back to Germany. But he eventually he sponsored during his Raumfahrt the election of the Franciscan Pietro Reinalducci as anti-pope Nicholas V, obviously against John XXII, on May the 12th, 1328. Nicholas submitted to John eventually in August 1330 and lived under house arrest in Avignon itself until his death 3 years later. This submission that John publicized as proof of the ultimate superiority of papal authority, by the way, because that was, in theory, again, the Pope created, a bit like during Ottonian times, by the emperor. And so in a way, it was ideologically incompatible, obviously, with anything that the papacy had developed to this point. So given that John had ultimately won, it meant that God's favor was with his system, so to say. John's theology, by the way, I should point out that all these popes of the great medieval civilization at this point were, again, coming from unspeakably advanced civilizational background. These people were strikingly overly educated in anything canon, Roman. They had a massive theological and juridical learning. We've seen recently also in videos about universities, etc. They are the cream of the cream as far as managing literally the single most advanced part of the world at this point. John's theological interventions further polarized opinion within Christendom, however, because especially from the 20s, something's off already. There are some indicators of broader decline, crisis. These wars have obviously caused them largely. And so the effective power of the papacy is declining. Here we're not even talking about the crusade against the Visconti. That is, again, one of the single most intense wars fought in the 14th century. But I have a video on that, and probably I'll come back on Milanese warfare from this era, because in depth, some of the single most, actually the single most important military development of the era happened there, properly in relation with the papal attempt at conquest of Milan, that, by the way, would have basically brought northern Italy under a papal state, and so would have changed history in a clamorous way. Instead, the Visconti managed to handle themselves marvelously from a military standpoint and begin properly the model of the condotta with their German knights that were also largely ideologized against not much the Pope, but actually Bertrand de Pouget fought himself with lots of Germans. But at that point, there was something almost mystical about chivalry, even more German chivalry. The Lombards had a great legacy in that, as well as leaders of these Germans at that point. So these are the same years of Dante writing the Commedia. The other authors actually push even further in terms of recognizing that Fortuna can be tamed, as a matter of fact. So concepts that are very classical, very traditional, very imperial, very Catholic in the truer sense of Catholic tradition. Interestingly enough, John XXII rejected the Franciscan doctrine of the absolute poverty of Christ and the apostles, which is also beautiful because, as Thatcher said, we remember the Good Samaritan because he had something to give, right? Otherwise, would have not been there. Maybe there were so many well-disposed Samaritans, but they didn't have much wealth to give up, even a piece of cloth. So it's incredibly important. It condemned this was a problem also internal to the church, because there were some radical Franciscan fringes that were essentially heretical. In fact, among the other things, there are crusades at this point against the Dulcinians. You've probably really heard of them if you're aware of Umberto Eco. They made his book. They made a famous movie with Sean Connery, The Name of the Rose, right? That talks about that. And those were a bunch of mother blippers, and fortunately were all burned at the stake. And they were essentially communists, right? So they condemned this concept of radical poverty that had created scandals also at the Sorbonne of Paris in the bull Cum Inter Non Nullos on November the 12th, 1323, as well in subsequent pronouncements that declared the position heretical and incompatible with the Church's right to hold property for its mission, which was, for telling you again, that there are some people, I will not make any names, but on the internet, they try to spread the idea that essentially the church is an anti-European concept. Like, these people were just literally defending property, right? Not just of the churches, because also lay authorities were the enforcers. The church did not technically have the faculty to put people to death as such. They had always a lay enforcer. And local communities were more than happy than killing these brigands at some point in the case of the Dulcinians, but also to operate the church itself from the most radical fringes that had unfortunately survived, especially among the Franciscans. Remember that this guy is a Dominican, right? So the Dominicans did not kid about this stuff. In fact, Minister General of the Franciscans, Michael of Cesena, William of Ockham, and Bonagrazia of Bergamo fled Avignon at this point because they were those fringe elements. We're in 1328, and they joined Louis IV, producing a series of polemical tracts that, as you know, attacked the legitimacy not of John's pontificate itself, but they questioned also the infallibility of papal teaching. Obviously, they were working for the emperor in this one of the single most radically heightened moments of ideological tension, regardless of or because exactly of the shortcomings of both universal powers. Teaching, for example, when this papal authority contradicted earlier tradition, actually it was very sloppy work, and it was very specifically dictated by Louis that took these people and others, as we were saying before, so to Munich. That admittedly Louis was a great ruler. He made Munich, for example, the great place that it is today. Bavaria owes much to Louis IV of Wittelsbach as you know, the most overwhelmingly prosper countries in the world today. These figures also advance arguments limiting papal power over temporal affairs and over the interpretation of evangelical poverty. Right? That obviously it is radical. This tells you also how the emperors, not the Ghibellines as a whole, but because many were deep Christian, right? But here, obviously, Louis IV is blowing on the embers of heresy because, you know, if you push for radical poverty or this kind of things, you're basically criticizing the Pope that is rich and powerful with his beautiful palace at Avignon and everything, right? John also reignited controversy late in his reign by preaching a series of sermons between November 1331 and March 1332, suggesting that the souls of the just do not enjoy the beatific vision of the divine essence until after the last judgment, because it's not a saint. Like this view that placed the immediate post-mortem reward of the blessed in a state of waiting rather than full vision, or at least it's a bit more complicated than this in the question of John the 22nd, but there is still a hierarchy, right, between a saint and a babe, like blessed. In any case, the position drew sharp criticism from theologians in Paris and elsewhere, who viewed it as incompatible with established doctrine on the immediate reward of the blessed and with passages in Scripture and the Fathers that seemed to affirm direct vision after death. This is obviously depending on the doctrine of the two natures and what you can essentially witness as you cross into heaven, right? But it's also clear, actually, from many different standpoints, that the proximity to God is not revealing the full plenitude of God per se, right? This is also overwhelming. And again, this would be very interesting also to confront with Dante's ending of the Commedia and everything. But let's say there is still a process of hierarchy and therefore of thresholds that is quite hierarchically fixed in the properly from the scriptures and more. So John formally retracted the teaching on his deathbed, interestingly enough, in December 1334, affirming in the presence of cardinals that the souls of the just contemplate the divine essence before the final resurrection, which, again, is also an interesting point because, again, the end time allows to properly the restoration of full divinity in the world. So it's a bit complicated. It's really not really in a theological sense, but say the way they were processing at the time in theological and juridical matters. The sense is quite important also for ecclesiastical policy, administration, so on. This was a clarification that John's successor, Benedict the 12th, would later confirm in the Constitution Benedictus Deus of 1336. Benedict the 12th was elected in the same month of John's death, adopted a markedly different tone from his predecessor. Jacques Fournier, born around 1285 in Saverdun and a Cistercian by training, had gained notoriety as inquisitor in the diocese of Pamiers from 1318 to 1325, where his register of interrogations, preserved in the Vatican Library, by the way, provides one of the most detailed sources for the social history of the late Cathar communities in the Pyrenean foothills, the methods of inquisitorial procedure in the early 14th century, and the texture of village life under the pressure of heresy trials. As Pope, Benedict annulled numerous expectative graces and pluralities granted by John the 22nd, enforced stricter residence for bishops and abbots under pain of excommunication, and promulgated constitutions reforming the Cistercian, Benedictine, and Franciscan orders with detailed regulations on poverty, enclosure, visitation, discipline, and the correction of abuses that had proliferated during the preceding decades of laxity. This in part was happening because of the big contraction of the world at the time. Universalism had brought people to move more, right? Resources were increasingly scarce, so it was felt again that what also the Avignonese papacy would later be criticized on in a sort of broader sense that had always been the problem of whoever wanted to criticize again the wealth of the church, that the prelates lived in a quite strong material comfort and so on, was mirrored by their lifestyle at a point. They had been commander of armies, they had courts on their own and so on. So at this point, there was a stricter discipline enforced, sort of relocalizing their persons, so to dedicate themselves better to the local church, etc. So it was meant as a capillary reform to reinstate sort of a stronger presence of the head of the local church. Benedict initiated the construction of the Palais Vieux, a massive fortified complex designed by Pierre Bresson and other architects, intended both as administrative headquarters and as a defensible stronghold against potential threats from imperial partisans, Italian exiles, or local unrest in a region still recovering from the aftermath of the Albigensian Wars. Right? Benedict also attempted to mediate between Philip VI of France and Edward III of England before open war erupted in 1337, at the beginning of the so-called 100 Years' War, that were, as you know, sort of different wars, but sort of engulfing the European Northwest roughly for more actually than 1 century, sending legates and proposing truces that might preserve the peace of Christendom. Although his efforts proved fruitless in the face of competing dynastic ambitions, the escalating fiscal demands of both crowns, and the momentum of feudal alliances that made compromise increasingly difficult. We recently made a video about Edward III, who was, again, as per title, the greatest and most complete military genius in English history, and he was incredibly capable, shrewd, and intelligent to exploit the systemic crisis of the great civilization that found in France the greatest incarnation. So the place where you could essentially get more from, in absolute terms, exploiting the same crisis. We know all the broader legal motivations and more, but obviously it revolved around an enormity of interests. Naturally, the papacy, as we were saying before, did not want major wars to escalate in Christendom, right? If they struck down, it's because they were essentially infringing on ecclesiastical immunities, privileges. The same papal power was naturally expanding, so also its enemies had their reasons to check that in a way. But in general, as far as normal relations between Christian countries was concerned, war was not normal, right? Actually, the Pope went the completely opposite direction throughout its entire history to stop warfare, right, at any moment. And this is incredibly relevant, at least to properly direct that warfare against the infidels. Clement VI, elected in May 1347, reverted to a more expansive and ceremonial style of government, right? You have to understand the pride, the power, the prestige that came with papal authority. And so again, the summer of this is sin, but at the end of the day, it's also what all other rulers sinned like, And so the papacy in this was also something particularly different, and that required such competition even with lay authorities for the reasons that we just explained. Pierre Roger, born around 1291, is Clement VI in Rosiers-d'Égletons and formerly Archbishop of Rouen, had served as a trusted counselor to Philip VI and brought strong personal ties to the French court that shaped his exercise of the papal office. He purchased Avignon outright from Joanna I of Naples on June the 9th, 1348, for 80,000 gold florins. That was the good price of a city at the time, extinguishing Angevin seigneurial rights over the city itself while preserving papal sovereignty over the adjacent Comtat Venaissin, and thereby securing full jurisdictional control over the urban center that had previously been subject to divided lordship as well. Joanna of Naples was handling a deep crisis, the civil war that broke out also with Hungary, the same Angevin helps, and in the wake of sort of the Neapolitan decline in the later decades of, in fact, the first half of the 14th century after the death of Robert the Wise. Clement enlarged the papal palace with the Palais Neuf, commissioned extensive fresco cycles from Matteo Giovannetti in his workshop, depicting scenes from the lives of saints, biblical narratives, and classical motifs drawn from Petrarchan and antique sources. You can still see them at the papal palace. And presided over a court renowned for its patronage of music, literature, and the visual arts. Right? I don't know if there is time to talk about Petrarch today, but as you know, great part of the Tuscan humanist, the founder of humanism, life and career was tied to Avignon. Right? At some point, he wanted to sort of detach himself from the Babylonian term was coined by him for Avignon. He was a pretty sort of introverted, sensitive, at point actually was a hypocritical guy. He had taken some vows, but he had children as well. So again, he actually had a great life overall. He was a great, as you know, diplomat, and besides a man of letter of enormous prestige, like he had this incredibly pleasant, like you can imagine at the time, like lifestyle of traveling across Europe, the great courts of Prague, of Avignon, and all across, and visiting all the cathedral chapters, finding old manuscript books. He sort of had this massive philological research. He was really a giant in the history of European literature, and he was quite tied to the Avignonese service initially, right? And you have all these great men there, and others, for example, like other artists, like musicians such as Philippe de Vitry, whose innovations in notation and rhythm helped define the so-called ars nova, and singers trained in the new polyphonic complexities found employment in the papal chapel. France was particularly advanced in music also because of its theological studies, a great congregations, and so this great scenographic profile that you can find from the lay to the ecclesiastical environment. Think about the great cathedrals of medieval France. Poets, humanists, and scholars gravitated to the Curia. There was a great international court attracted by the availability of benefices and the intellectual atmosphere that Clement, in particular, deliberately cultivated. His pontificate coincided with the catastrophic arrival of the Black Death, though. We are in 1347, 1350. Clement issued protective bulls for Jewish communities accused of well poisoning. Because, as you know, at that point, further Judenhass exploded in Europe. For this, Clement remained in Avignon himself to give the example, while many cardinals and curial officials perished. It was very courageous to do. As a matter of fact, ordered processions and prayers for deliverance from the plague. That's what a pope has to do, right? Also at the risk of of his own life. And reportedly ordered large fires to be kept burning in the streets in an attempt to purify the air, a measure consistent with contemporary medical theory. They thought that this disease spread across the air. Innocent VI, elected in December 1352, imposed rigorous economies after the prodigality of his predecessor. This is also kind of obvious considering the general economic situation in the world. You have really to tighten your belt. Etienne Aubert, Innocent VI, was a former lawyer and cardinal bishop of Ostia, right, the port of Rome, enforcing residence requirements more rigorously, reducing curial expenditure by cutting back on lavish ceremonial and necessary offices. He was the one to dispatch Cardinal Gil Alvarez Carrillo de Albornoz to Italy in 1353 with wide legatine powers. Again, Albornoz is such a great figure, we should make a video about him. And this was also relatively propedeutic to a return of the papacy to Rome. Like here, we don't have time we're looking at the major events of the various pontificates, but there was, of course, an awareness overall that the papal states were by far the most important asset that the papacy had. And especially the crisis now made Avignon a sort of more exposed location overall, right? Also think about the free companies during the 100 Years' War. This is before Poitiers and various sort of the escalation of other issues. But say the interesting aspect of this is that there is a whole papal states that awaits for the Pope, and this is historically a patchwork of different dominions that the papacy has never fully controlled in any direct way, right? The legates here are naturally papal appointees with great powers, were cardinals themselves. They were experienced in legal matters, but also ones of war. Again, Albornoz was a veteran of the Reconquista. And in general, like he was meant to handle central Italian affairs with an iron fist, because much of also the wars that had been fought in Italy. We just recently made a video about Arezzo's that is, was bordered this Ghibelline commune bordering the Papal State in the first half of the 14th century, had devastated those areas. We've seen it very well. In fact, Albornoz recovered Bologna that had already been previously been the location of Bertrand de Pouget, that was eventually expelled from there. Actually, he died pretty old in age, much later, had a very long life back in Occitania. But Bologna was such an important northern Italian city within the Papal States. The same Romagnol area, much of the Mark of Ancona, that again had been devastated by the Tarlati of Pietramala from Arezzo and their Ghibelline allies in central Italy. So this meant that many lands had been usurped. They had to return to wealth, power, and that could sort of back the Pope. This is what essentially Albornoz is sent to do. Albornoz is a plenipotentiary and reforms a lot of things. More often than not, he actually fights, fortifies. Like, that's how you actually rebuild the Papal State. He subdued or co-opted many of the signori who had usurped papal authority during the preceding decades of absence, and promulgated as well the constitutions of Aegidius. After him, in 1357, this is a comprehensive administrative code for the Papal States, establishing uniform judicial and fiscal procedures across the recovered territories, regulating the conduct of rectors and governors, and laying the groundwork for a more centralized temporal government, because that's what the Papal States were. They weren't, a great ecclesiastical possession. I mean, they technically were, as the Patrimonium Sancti Petri overall, and so they belonged to the church in a broader sense, but they were lay powers as well. So there was a full temporal power over the local, feudal lords, communes, and etc., that were effectively a papal state, or a sum of states, so to say, under the papal signory, right? We'll have to talk more about the Papal States. We never really made so many videos, after all, about it. I have something, but it's important to look a bit more at the progression of this. These successes restore a viable territorial base, by the way, strengthened papal temporal authority in central Italy, and revived the possibility of a return to Rome under more secure conditions that had existed since the 1320s. Everybody was complaining about this. Petrarch, St. Catherine of Siena, there was a general feeling, right, that Italy had remained stripped of the papacy, that Rome needed the Curia most urgently. And this is understandable, because the Italians, by the way, were actually pioneering the recovery of sort of more classical forms with humanism, etc. So obviously Rome could not be simply abandoned. There are some medieval history passages that stress how Rome fell to complete misery, but it's not entirely true. Rome was a pretty big center overall, compared to most European ones, and in any case remain a great center of power, of spirituality. It's not like the Pope goes over to Avignon and the Papal States do not exist anymore. Nobody's in charge. No, this is wrong, right? There was a thick net of administrators, of ecclesiastical, probably of prelates, of magnates that run the business. Urban V, elected on October 28, 1362, acted on that possibility of coming back to Rome. Guillaume de Grimoire, abbot of Saint Victor in Marseille, these backgrounds, as you understand, are also fairly varied, and they all come from the south of France. So initially, yes, this, as we've seen, there is a connection with Philip IV, but as you understand, these are very specifically picked individuals without a specific vicinity, even to a milieu or another. All right. He was a former professor of canon law at Montpellier, and the same Avignon. He entered Rome on October 16, 1367, after a voyage that took him from Marseille to Corneto and up to the Tiber. He resided there until September 1370, celebrated the reception of Emperor John V Palaiologus in October 1369, who, by the way, briefly professed Roman Catholic faith in hopes of military aid against the Ottomans and in exchange for financial and diplomatic support. All right? This would be a leitmotif of later Byzantine history, going over to Rome, right? The same emperors personally. The Pope also attempted to reform the Roman clergy, restore order in the city, repair major basilicas damaged by neglect and earthquake. Again, Europe had not gone, the world had not been faring very well in the previous decade. These were between the 1340s and 1370s, basically the toughest periods in later medieval times. All right. And so the Pope attempted to reassert direct papal governance in many ways, including over the turbulent Roman commune that had, as you know, also experimented a period of great autonomy and of more republican profile under Rienzi, Cola di Rienzi, that became sort of famous figure in many ways, was connected also with Petrarch. He was also in Rome, crowned poet. He was at the court of Prague, schooling the local administrators in proper classical Latin, by the way, also as a Roman, not quite commoner, but still some literate. Like, there is a divide in Europe in terms of actual educational and cultural output. In Rome, let's always remember this, Rome historically, before and after Christianity, is the center from which Europe is civilized. All right, Europe is not civilized by Greece, if not through Rome, and probably in a strictly continental sense. It's the Romans, the Italics, that spread literacy across Europe through the Roman Church largely at some point. First the Roman Empire, then the Papacy, and Rome keeps being by far the most important cultural center in a broader emanatistic sense that reactivates the ones all across our Europe, right? So this can never be, and it can never be separated from Avignon itself, but it can't be forgotten. It must be much more prominently and magnitudinally represented as objectively as it was indeed. Continued instability in central Italy, particularly the defiance of Perugia, interestingly enough, that had historically been, as we've seen, very papal, but now resisted the reaffirmation of papal authority, even after Albornoz's campaigns, and because they had habituated themselves to be too autonomous. In fact, actually, they were so black of wealth because the papacy said, okay, well, keep expanding over the surrounding communes, right? We need a strong proxy there to make our work. But when now there is the crisis and the papacy returns, everybody starts whining because they have to pay again. And so that doesn't, this is also a leitmotif in the history of civilization. You have at this point many other issues, including especially the aggressive expansion of Milan. All right, Milan at this point is rocking hard, is basically almost able to take over the entirety of northern central Italy, and it's in fact infiltrating also the papal states. Some communes there dedicate themselves to Milan. We're at the time of Bernabo Visconti. We could make a video about him, his military exploit, that are dangerous enough. Besides, at this point, if you look at the dates, you know what happens in France, because there are threats to Avignon, even from the routier companies that roamed the Rhone Valley after the truce of Bretigny in 1360. I made 2 long videos about the free companies, and we described more or less all of them in sort of as a broader highlight, and then we'll come back on them. And these are dangerous. They come to threaten the same Avignon. There is also an insistent pressure at this point from Charles V of France in inducing Urban to withdraw first to Montefiascone and then to Avignon, where he died in December 1370 after a brief illness. The French king wanted the Pope in France, but things were to change at this point. In fact, the King of France himself was not so powerful as before, especially after Poitiers and all the issues that had arisen from there. Gregory XI, elected on December the 30th, 1370, faced escalating crisis in Italy that made continued residence in Avignon increasingly untenable. Politically, strategically, that it didn't make any sense anymore. You had the sort of compact landmass encompassing like an entire region in Europe. Why not going back and reasserting your authority? Pierre Roger de Beaufort, this is the secular name of Gregory, nephew of Clement VI, by the way, and the last of the Avignon popes, confronted also the War of the Eight Saints 1375-1378. Made a video about Florentine history, the one about the second half of the 14th century, in fact, in which we discussed that war, in which Florence organized a league of central Italian cities against papal legates. And this is really incredible. If you had just seen like the mentality of 2 generations before, when the entire Guelph system was well-oiled, compact, etc., and Florence and the papacy were forever allies and whatever, this makes you think, right, about today's times, but just not in a strict parallelism, but just bear in mind that in times of crisis, the bigger alliances normally fade. And it's not like sort of other powers much profit from that. On the contrary, like there is rather some provincialization of the reality. But we are in different times for reasons as well. And you have the city of Florence imposing an embargo on grain exports to papal territories during a period of scarcity that threatened famine in the Romagnol and Marquesan areas in particular. The papal response, led by Legate Robert of Geneva, that was the future Clement VII, by the way, that was an anti-pope, by the way, because as you know, Clement VII was, the famous Renaissance pope, included the employment of Breton and English mercenaries under the famed John Hawkwood. Right. The massacre at Cesena in February 1377, in which between 25 and 3,500 inhabitants perished according to contemporary chroniclers, including the Florentine Marchionne di Coppo Stefani, intensified anti-papal sentiment across the peninsula and fueled propaganda that portrayed the Avignon Papacy as alien and tyrannical, right? Which, as a matter of fact, wasn't quite the case. Again, always remember that if anybody was tyrannical at the time, it was pretty much anyone, like by our own standards, but that there are very specific cultural references, authors, etc., that specifically remained as a narrative. Obviously, what a Florentine chronicler says in the 14th century is something that echoes in Western civilization many centuries later. Right, but you have to understand there the context. Catherine of Siena's repeated letters urging reform of the clergy, peace among the Italian cities, and return to Rome, combined with the deteriorating military situation in the Papal States, growing conviction among many observers that prolonged absence from the Apostolic See undermined the legitimacy of the Roman Pontiff itself, and the personal conviction of Gregory that the restoration of the see to Rome was essential to the preservation of the Church's unity, persuaded the Pope to depart. He left Avignon on September 13th, 1376, embarked at Marseille on October 2nd after a solemn ceremony, by the way, attended by the cardinals and the city's notables. It was probably also a very compact, moving moment. The pontiff sailed along the Provençal coast with stops at Villefranche and Genoa, reached Corneto on December the 6th, and entered Rome on January the 17th, 1377, greeted by processions, orations, and decorations that emphasized the restoration of the papal residence to its ancient seat and the end of what Petrarch and others had called the Babylonian captivity. This was also a clamorous moment in European history, and it opened to a completely new phase of the same. Right? Gregory's death on March 27, 1378, triggered the election of Bartolomeo Prignano, Archbishop of Bari, as Urban VI on April the 8th. Reports of intimidation by the Roman crowd during the conclave, crowds reportedly shouting threats, demanding an Italian pope at this point, right, and pressing against the doors of the conclave chamber, prompted 13 cardinals to withdraw to Anagni, that recurs as we're, and then to Fondi, where on September the 20th, 1378, this is a town south of Rome, they elected Robert of Geneva as Clement VII. Clement re-established the Curia in Avignon, notoriously, this was the Western Schism, securing recognition from France, Castile, Aragon, Navarre, Scotland, and several Italian seigniories, including parts of the Kingdom of Naples under Joanna I. It was still there, this. The resulting schism, as you know, divided Latin Christendom along lines that largely followed existing political alignments. Interestingly enough, the Roman obedience included England, most of the empire, Hungary, Poland, Portugal after 1385 at least, and much of northern and central Italy. While the Avignon obedience dominated France, the Iberian kingdoms, except Portugal, as we've seen, Scotland, and parts of Savoy and southern Italy. This is because these places were more aligned with the French, but not only, that wanted the Pope home, but there were, again, lots of other issues. And I never really made a video about the Western Schism, and this, again, tells you how much there is actually to know overall. The division hardened into two parallel curial administrations, each claiming universality, each creating cardinals, each collecting revenues, and each excommunicating the adherents of the other. It was a consequence of the moral disorder followed the crisis of the 14th century. Clement VII died on September 16, 1394. The Avignon cardinals elected Pedro Martinez de Luna, an Aragonese canonist and diplomat who had served both Clement and his predecessors in numerous legations as Benedict XIII antipope. Benedict maintained his claim with extraordinary tenacity, even after France withdrew obedience in 1398. And a French army under Geoffroy Le Mingre, the famous Marshal Boucicaut, besieged the papal palace from September 1398 until March 1403. Absolutely, we have to make a video about Boucicaut. As a matter of fact, Benedict escaped the siege through a clandestine exit, reportedly lowered in a basket, to make the whole scene more humiliating, and withdrew first to Perpignan and later to Peñíscola in Aragon, where he died on May the 23rd, 1423, after continuing, by the way, to assert his rights and creating a small college of loyal cardinals. It was a mini curia. And so here we also enter the age of councils, and we talk about this for telling you how much sort of consequences the Avignonese papacy had brought with it. The Council of Pisa in 1409, summoned by cardinals of both obediences in an attempt to break the deadlock, deposed both Gregory XII and Benedict XIII, and clamorously, as notoriously elected Pietro Filargi, Archbishop of Milan, as Alexander V, so inaugurating a third obedience that attracted support from many previously neutral parties, interestingly enough, including parts of Germany, northern Italy, Sicily, and the University of Paris, even. For telling you how political this was, and there were three popes at some point at the same time. So Alexander's successor, Baldassare Cossa, John the 23rd, called the Council of Constance in 1414 under pressure from Emperor Sigismund of Luxembourg amid growing exhaustion with the schism across Europe. It was really creating nothing but problems, as a matter of fact. You understand also how the sort of image of the papacy was undermined. It's actually, the papacy were incredibly powerful. I made an entire video actually about 15th century Roman papal power, which is sort of intense. It tells you, like, look at what prestige, what immense wealth still, after the crisis of universalism, like the papacy had at this point in history. The Council of Constance secured Gregory XII's abdication, where on July the 4th, 1415, deposed John the 23rd on June the 17th of the same year, after he fled the city in disguise, and excommunicated Benedict XIII on July the 26th, 1417, after he refused to appear or resign despite repeated summons. Today we mostly discuss sort of this papal matters. Naturally, the Council of Constance had sort of much broader implications, issues at stake, and so on. You can watch sort of many videos I made on the period to know. Also, we discussed about Sigismund of Luxembourg, even these were the same years of Azincourt for that matter, and so very interesting things going on. On November the 11th, 1417, the council elected Oddone Colonna as Martin V. And if you know papal history, you know who he was, politically wise. He restored essentially the formal unity to the Latin Church after 39 years of division. In establishing the principle, however contested in later decades, this was more than half the Avignonese papacy's length, right? So it's a very long tail of this all, that a general council could act to preserve the unity of the church when the papal office itself had become the source of schism, which again was not very good. We're about to have literal press in the 15th century towards about the papacy, right? And this speaks of the fracture, the crisis, sort of the volume of the issues, how much the great medieval civilization had shrunk in a matter of just 1 century, right? So it's more like a litmus test than sort of the Avignon Papacy to be considered as a cause of this whole. The administrative legacy of the Avignon period proved, in fact, enduring and far-reaching. And in positive ways, the Apostolic Chancery refined its registration procedures, developing standardized forms, protocols, and a system of minutantes and scriptores that increased the speed and volume of outgoing letters while preserving their legal precision. The papacy had already pioneered, essentially, bureaucratic administration in the Middle Ages. Right? If you wonder when bureaucracy is born, it's not the 18th century, it's probably the papacy in France and Naples in the 14th. The apostolic penitentiary handled an increasing volume of reserved cases, issuing absolutions, dispensations, and indulgences under streamlined procedures that balanced pastoral mercy with fiscal necessity. The Rota Romana formalized its appellate jurisdiction over major ecclesiastical suits, establishing a professional cadre of auditors who heard cases in rotation and whose decisions contributed to the development of more uniform canonistic jurisprudence across Latin Christendom. Consider that when we look at the early 14th century, so the beginning of the Avignonese papacy, say Western Christendom, Latin Christendom was sort of very well established in a broader, also beyond ecclesiastical sense, right? There is a radical dominance of Franco-Roman civilization across all civilized Europe that has, in fact, began to properly stabilize, to stabilize across all across the board along feudal patterns, but also ones of culture, as we were saying before, proper administration of tax collection. I mean, again, Rome had largely done this in a broader civilizational, irradiatory sense, right, on the basis, naturally, of the greater force of the local polities. We should actually make lots of videos explaining how this had been possible to begin with, because very often when you hear, especially content deliberately designed at minimizing Christianity or pretending that it did not exist, like these are some of the most radically impacting civilizational establishments in the history of mankind, not just of Europe, right? And this all happened from Rome, right? There were local lay powers that enforced the ecclesiastical measures that had naturally the decisive moral majority of their own people. Otherwise, they would have not. This starts from the evangelization of Europe. This was all done largely without conquest. It was largely done through internal development and choice, right, to follow this. So that's an incredibly relevant aspect. But it's also true that especially in the 13th century, like the whole fabric of European stabilization of power, etc., was not so civilly and administratively solid as it would grow in the later Middle Ages, also as a consequence of the crisis, because they needed essentially to stabilize the picture. It was otherwise terrifying. So you realize that the power of the church itself was immense all across this land, and that it deeply contributed to that same ecclesiastical affirmation. That the same church had produced canon law as much as the communes, the universities, the empire, etc., had produced in parallel, and thanks also to each other in that sense, civil law, so essentially Roman law, and readapted properly also to the needs of Western Europe at this point. In an overly expansive way, then up until the crisis was not it did not have some sort of safeguard measures to fundamentally stabilize the world. I've seen as soon as crisis struck, that the general sentiment was to go at one another. That's obviously what would happen in times of trouble, like people lose their head, etc. But in this sense, we could think big crisis, the system was to falter. Right, you would say, well, there was the Reformation later, but the Reformation was also largely witnessing to the nationalization of the church, local church, and the maintenance of it, actually taking over of the enormous and very well administered ecclesiastical assets in the hands of lay power. So that were normally more powerful than the ecclesiastical seigniories. That at some point had also their armies and so on, especially in probably interwoven in the fabric of lay power, like in Central Europe mostly, right? So the greatness of this, right? If this had been something happening in, I mean, we all know how the church spread in Roman times, and everybody thinks that that's a chapter of a book that they must read. Nobody seems in pop culture to understand what happened during the Middle Ages, and the fact that there was a parallel civilization to the classical one, comparable in scale, and that fundamentally reaffirmed this enormous civil achievements that nobody today talks about. There's obviously a prevalently Protestant Anglo-American kind of perspective that has completely prevented any kind of discourse in that sense. Not because they are not aware of that. I mean, they also research and study and teach about it, but because in general, right, the narrative was never popular. The narrative was never sort of thrown to the masses. Like masses today, people actually think that if you think that the Inquisition was a good, positive, incredibly good thing as a whole, you're either a religious fanatic or some sort of strange, hyper-conservative person. But this is what also the current historiography all over the world is telling us that it was, and still people are completely unaware of this. They just don't want to accept it, perhaps. And so this is properly the fabric of today's Europe. I mean, we come from that, and we somehow decided to obscure our past in so many different ways. This is just the Middle Ages. Obviously, much was done also for antiquity. But studying Christian history, papal history, history of the church, is absolutely necessary in order to appreciate the whole. Like, what's the point of studying history, not studying history of the church? It's incredibly difficult to provide any ground for any kind of motivation. Let's not even talk about justification. Nobody should even ever seek to begin with. But for telling you the civilizational impact, the fact that if you live in a civilized world, you also owe it to the overwhelming advancements of the church during the medieval millennium. And you've been told it's a democratic thing against the church somehow, more or less. That's what the pattern is. Like, this is akin to a mental condition. This is not normal. It's not normal that a fully developed human being actually lives in a world by not understanding the basic elements of its sort of civilizational history. And so it's actually very scary. But just to conclude here of the list, because fiscal instruments, for example, and not as the first year's revenue of major benefices. Common services and petty services, payments scaled to the assessed value of benefices, spoils, the movable goods of deceased prelates, vacancies, revenues during periods when benefices were reserved to the Camera, and a host of lesser exactions generated revenues that sustained a curia whose personnel numbered several hundred by the 1350s, including notaries, abbreviators, scriptors, procurators, advocates, solicitors, courier, and domestic staff ranging from chaplains to cooks and stable hands. But mostly we're talking millions of florins that were used to drastically stabilize at least the political pattern. Again, mostly the clash at this point was more secular than ecclesiastic in nature. This was not even as spiritual as, I don't know, the investiture controversy in many ways, right? Again, the wars against the Visconti. So you understand that against the Holy Roman Empire, they were very regional. They were already the measure of how, if anything, it was the papacy that constituted at this point a universal power, whereas its enemies were more an aggregate of different forces. The concentration of and again, there are old historical reasons about this. If you are interested in them, check out my videos, especially about the Angevins of Naples, what the situation before the Avignon Papacy was in Italy for the papacy. It was not actually a bad one to begin with, even though, again, they decided to move out, especially it was, as we've seen, it began as a circumstance, and then because of the war that engulfed the peninsula, it sort of turned out to be a practical necessity, right? But overall, it was also later a great degree of continuity just out of inertia, right? Or the fact that in any case they controlled the papal states also from Avignon. The system worked mostly locally, that wasn't a shift of papal power in bases from Italy to France. It didn't really happen like that. Without mentioning, of course, all the ties, all what came from the rest of Europe is in and of itself like something mobile in that case. Now, the concentration of patronage in Avignon is also deeply relevant. It accelerated the creation of this French-dominated College of Cardinals by 1378, roughly 2/3, because otherwise they were international, right? All the living cardinals had been created by Avignon popes and entrenched the practice of papal reservation and provision, whereby the pope directly appointed incumbents to a growing proportion of bishoprics, abbacies, canonries, and other dignities, often years in advance, through expectative graces. This changes, while strengthening the institutional capacity of the papacy and enabling it to function effectively outside Rome for nearly 7 decades, also intensified criticism of curial venality, absenteeism, pluralism, and the perceived subordination of ecclesiastical office to financial and political considerations. Especially the latter is a bit difficult to make given the nature of the papacy already at that point. And in fact, it should mostly sort of explain instead why this move happened and why, in general, yes, there could have been some at a sort of geographical, national level, a detachment from Italy. That was the case, but also, guess where the papacy came back to? Rome was not an option. Today we haven't talked about Rome to begin with, but let's say nobody in Avignon was thinking, okay, now Avignon is another Rome or something like that. No, it's very contextual. It may seem shocking because the image of the Avignon papacy, of the Babylonian captivity, all these things that pass down to history for different sort of historiographical, ideological, confessional reasons. It's not actually one of particular decay, considering what was happening in the world at the time overall, right? You don't hear, I don't know, this country was, I don't know, Bohemia lost 1/3 of its population and political independence after having been the heart of 14th century Europe because of a criminal heresy like the Hussite one. Those are actually in pop culture depicted almost as heroes of some sort. Nobody tells you how it ended. It's all about, oh, look, the Wagenburgs that the Hussites didn't even invent. Nobody tells you, well, if you look at the outcome of the 100 Years' War, England sort of shrank dramatically, it remained less developed. But the Renaissance is this great moment. We liberated ourselves from the church with the Anglican Reformation. That by far is far worse, in my opinion, than for example, the later, what happened in the 17th century, in particular, the Civil War, the Glorious Revolution, and so on. It's the narrative, right? If you're habituated with a narrative just because you think that you have to wave the flag of wherever piece of dirt you find yourself in, well, you may miss something called transcendence. That is the root of imperial Catholic tradition. And if you don't know, as I always say, if you don't know what Catholic means, you may have a bit of an existential issue with yourself, right? But a deep one. Because if you don't know, you don't know. If you think that Catholic means it's that confession, right? It's the papacy. We have a problem collectively for not having taught it to you as something you could learn in primary school, as a matter of fact. It's not even that complicated. Overall, the prolonged French residence, the preponderance of French cardinals created during these decades, and the perception that the papacy had become an instrument of Valois policy eroded the universal character of the office. Even though there isn't much of evidence to suggest that the Avignonese papacy was actually a simple pawn of the King of France at all. It was essentially the same papal states with a particularly and sort of newly prestigious center of power. It surely was more French than Italian in background, in context, but it didn't have actually, it was a politically independent power on its own, and the church could have never been otherwise, right? So the idea that this would strengthen the national particularism within the church may be true to the extent that, however, there was a massive crisis ongoing in the world, with actually a localization, nationalization, and regionalization of power that invested every power, including France, telling the truth. And in fact, Avignon could even be seen as the proof of actually a French fracture, with a renewed loss on the south during the 100 Years' War. And so it shouldn't really be applied to the Avignon church per se. It actually is a pretty interesting and powerful and incredible feat, right? But it's mostly the Western Schism that was born out of perhaps the proof that all of this was in many ways negative and somehow, again, reflecting the mean interests of this shrinking civilization in the mid-14th century, all the devastating things that were going on. Nourish, in fact, the conciliar theory among theologians and canonists who argued that the church and council possessed authority superior to a delinquent or divided pontiff, which doesn't make much sense in many ways, not just theological ones, but let's skip this aspect, and contributed to the long-term weakening, in any case, of the papacy's moral and political authority in the century preceding the Reformation. So actually it wasn't much the Avignon Papacy that caused that as such. It was rather the opposition to the return of the papacy to Rome, which is actually what seems like mostly counterintuitive, because you say there were three popes. I look at how the church had turned to be, but what church are we talking about? We look at anti-popes. There were anti-popes in the Middle Ages, another point, but nobody thinks, oh my God, the church at that point was weakened by that. Why? Because the course that we're looking at here is not even what the church was taking. It was a bit like the entire universal power and the actual capacity of individual states to pursue a truly imperial ecumenic policy, including the papacy and the empire and France, etc. So it's a problem overall in investing everybody, and definitely the mid-14th century is not a particularly positive moment to recall in the pages of medieval history. What is actually great instead is that the return to Rome in 1377, and in spite even of the schism that immediately followed, right? And you can see them at less as abrupt breaks than the culmination of tensions inherent in the prolonged extraterritorial residence. Also, the profound reorganization of ecclesiastical governance that definitely played a role, because it's obvious that from Avignon, the ways to administer Christendom were sort of recalibrated on a more regional basis, but at the same time, again, Avignon did not rest on itself, right? What they collected from the rest of Europe and from the Papal States was by far bigger than anything they had there. And so it's something else, it's something pettier, right? And so the shifting balance between spiritual claims and temporal realities that had taken place on the banks of the Rhone are more like the product of the current times rather than specifically the move to Avignon that, as we've seen, was surely the fruit of the beginning of the issues at the beginning of the 14th century, but still part of a actually pretty glorious moment in the history of papal power in its same civilizational output. And it's really surprising that we sometimes, like when we look at history, that there are these moments of essential civilizational displacement that are ever hardly the canceling of previous civilization, but a rewiring that in the moment leaves people sort of disoriented, because it's mostly like they're fearing about something that is actually even not there, if not in their minds, right? And so history teaches us that change does happen, but it shouldn't be seen as something definitive or a simple break with the past, because actually there is much to salvage in the past that the same history of Catholic civilization, I think, dramatically exemplifies, right? So much could be said about the Avignon Papacy. This video, perhaps, we are arrived to 2 hours. Yes, I think that there is a pretty good sense of how this thing went overall. I think this was a very introductory video. Overall, I liked it. Again, too few was said, obviously, because it's just an introduction for the original series. I made, 64 videos about the Papal States. Well, yes, because they included also some actual Papal States individually meant. We talked about Perugia today, for example. So I inserted lots of stuff that is not technically or literally the Papal States, but I could make a bit of a trimming here. But overall, well, it's still Papal history anyway, one way or another, and we will keep looking at this, including like much more in-depth videos about the Avignon Papacy. Honestly, the reason why this did not, we didn't cover this before is a bit random, truly. I made actually a couple of videos about the Avignon Papacy. I have one video from 2019 that I didn't even re-upload with the updated pictures. I have one from that also was older, around from, I think, from the same time, 2020 thing, that I re-uploaded in 2021. Actually a pretty good video, made only 300 views, that actually talks a bit about the politics of art during the Italian Trecento and how this was connected with Rome, Avignon, Tuscany. So there is actually so much to discuss about this topic that it's almost embarrassing to provide the presentation like this. Let's simply say, okay, well, first of all, talk about better than nothing. But you understand the broader implications. And so I actually urge you to study Christian history, to study ecclesiastical history, papal history, because you truly want to know it for practical expandability. The Chinese began to study papal history because they want to know, the Chinese, how something can last for 2,000 years the way it does, right? And that's also something that you may want to consider in strictly traditional terms, instead of sort of trashing Christianity as a problem. Well, the problem is you. Let's be honest about this. In any case, however you see it, if that accountability was restored, perhaps we would also have many more people educated, including in Christian history, in papal history, etc. For the rest, what do I have in coming for you in this Easter tide, so to say? I will not spoiler you. I can only tell you that there is something a bit more about Catholic tradition in a particular country that you will see hopefully tomorrow. Then for Easter, I have a real surprise. It's history of philosophy, telling the truth, but about a very interesting topic, that an author in particular that actually lives at the time of the Avignon Papacy and also gets in trouble at some point, but that left a very important mark, at least in some aspects of, especially of traditional spirituality, right? And then what was thinking about, this was it. There is from the cycle, actually from the lottery, another Christian history video, and that is about a topic that we already covered, telling the truth. And but that is always good to repeat in a way or another, and then we'll pass to something spicier. Again, we have always such a lot of stuff to do, but I'm really glad to share with you all this good stuff, really, because again, when you get these videos illustrate how good it is to talk about Christian history. I see that you like my videos on ancient Christianity. Naturally, I make really a lot. I must say that my Christian history playlist, it's very old, so probably got not even so many views, but say ancient Christianity, perhaps in parallel, maybe a bit more. Probably. Yeah, there are more people interested in ancient Christianity than medieval Christianity. It's very, very weird. I mean, you understand why, in a sense. I mean, why these people may be biased in the sense, but say not in the sense that it's justifiable. Like if you don't study medieval Christianity, it's a bit difficult to get anywhere really with anything else. Let's see if medieval Christianity makes more, actually, because that was the first playlist I counted was Christian history in general. Yeah, medieval Christianity does actually, but you see how ridiculous the thing is. Like you make the magnum opus of Christian history, 233 videos. Views, meh. But if it's ancient Christianity, because maybe it's more like, Christian apologism or patristic, or the arguments against Christianity or Christianization of the empire, this kind of sort of loaded topics people watching want to know. Medieval Christianity, because maybe it's just like the more traditional idea of the Crusades, etc. So some Christians or some traditionalists like that aspect, but they don't maybe care about Christian history as a whole or ancient. You see, you cannot understand something by parceling it out of the wall. Like you must have a context in order to understand everything. And Christian history has 2,000 years of itself, first of all, as a context, plus a broader context as well. So it's highly unlikely that you would understand this without a proper approach to the wall. Now, what to say here? We will talk about this again at some point. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. For now, thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.